Want to know how one spy managed to stop a third world war that was on the verge of erupting? And how he deceived the most powerful intelligence agency in the world, the KGB? They tried to execute him, but he managed to escape from right under their noses in Moscow. And how one of the most dangerous spies in the world ended up in the trunk of a car to escape across the border? If you want to know the story of double agent Oleg Gordievsky, then you have to watch today's video with us. Today is July 16th, 1985. A severe storm has hit Moscow. Rain is pouring down hard, and the sky is filled with thunder and lightning. The hero of our story is an agent in Russian intelligence, the KGB, sitting next to a small bakery on Kutuzovsky Prospect at 7:30 p.m. He's waiting for an agent from British intelligence. At first glance, you might think he's waiting to arrest him or to exchange information, but let me tell you, he's waiting to escape Russia with him. And to know the full story, we have to go back in time a bit. Oleg Gordievsky's upbringing. In 1938, Oleg was born in Russia, or the former Soviet Union. His family had deep roots in the Soviet security apparatus, as his father was an officer in the secret police that formed the true beginning of the Soviet intelligence agency, the KGB. From a young age, Gordievsky was very intelligent, excelled in his studies, and loved his country. He was proficient in German from a young age and later succeeded in getting his education from the Moscow State Institute of International Relations, one of the most elite institutions in the Soviet Union. After graduating from the institute, he found himself joining the Soviet Security Service. There, he received intensive training in the arts of espionage and surveillance, expanded his language studies, and became fluent in Danish, Swedish, and Norwegian, in addition to the German he learned in his early school years. Because of all this, he became qualified to carry out intelligence missions in Northern Europe. In August 1961, Oleg was assigned his first mission in East Berlin, which was a hotbed for spies during the Cold War. This was a turning point in Gordievsky's thinking. A few days after his arrival in Berlin, he witnessed with his own eyes the construction of the Berlin Wall, the wall that separated people from each other. He saw how the Soviet Union imposed a blockade on the city, and he began to feel fear and unease towards the Soviet system. A year later, he returned to Moscow, only to leave for his new mission, this time in Copenhagen, the capital of Denmark, in 1963. After becoming an official officer in the KGB, he was sent to the Soviet embassy in Copenhagen in 1966. Although his mission was simple and routine, it became a historic turning point in his life because he was able to see the freedom that didn't exist within the Soviet Union. He realized that life in the Soviet Union was like a prison. In 1968, he witnessed the attack of Soviet tanks and the Soviet army on the city of Prague to crush the protests in Czechoslovakia. The tanks that crushed the dreams of the people. At that moment, Gordievsky exploded with anger and knew from the bottom of his heart that he no longer believed in the country he served. He now saw the Soviet system as brutal and oppressive. When he was recalled to the Soviet Union in 1970, he didn't want to return. He wanted to stay in Denmark. Gordievsky and British intelligence. After 2 years spent in Moscow, another opportunity came for him to leave the Soviet Union. During that period, Denmark had managed to expose a large number of KGB spies and expelled them from the country. That's why the KGB wanted someone fluent in Danish to be stationed in Copenhagen. Indeed, in 1972, Gordievsky returned to Copenhagen. However, this time, Danish intelligence was monitoring Gordievsky and informed British intelligence, MI6. At that time, MI6 suspected Gordievsky's leanings away from the KGB and saw that he was frustrated with the Soviet system. Therefore, MI6 decided to use Gordievsky to their advantage. One day, Gordievsky was surprised by a visit from an old friend from his university days, Stanislav Kaplan, a former KGB spy who had previously defected to the West. The two met and reminisced. Gordievsky anticipated that Kaplan was trying to pressure him into being recruited by British intelligence. Gordievsky indirectly expressed his desire to defect from the KGB. Sometime later, he met with the head of the MI6 station in Copenhagen. After a series of meetings, Gordievsky finally expressed his wish to join British intelligence, thus announcing his defection from the KGB. The strange thing is that Gordievsky wasn't like any other spy. He didn't do it for money and even refused to receive a salary for joining MI6. His main reason was that he had come to see the Soviet system as a lie and an oppressive regime. At that time, Gordievsky was in a sham marriage because the KGB forced its agents to marry before going abroad. However, he entered into an affair with Leyla Aliyeva, who worked as a writer at the World Health Organization in Copenhagen. Because of these relations, he was divorced from his previous wife, which was, of course, an immoral crime in the eyes of the KGB, and because of it, he was recalled to Moscow again. In 1978, he returned to Moscow and was forced to stay there. At that point, MI6 decided to cut off all contact with Gordievsky because any small mistake could expose him. Indeed, communications remained severed between Gordievsky and MI6 for 3 years, until 1982, when Soviet intelligence gave him another chance to travel outside the Soviet Union, and luckily for him, this time it was to Britain itself. Gordievsky's intelligence and his quick mastery of English made him the ideal person for the KGB in London. At this time, MI6 was very pleased because Gordievsky wasn't just an ordinary spy, but one of the best intelligence assets within the KGB. So, they began to arrange the situation for him in London by engineering plots to expel Soviet political intelligence chiefs in London, until Gordievsky became the head of intelligence for the KGB station in London itself and was promoted to the rank of lieutenant colonel. Stopping World War III. Gordievsky became very important to MI6, while at the same time, the KGB believed they had a dangerous man in the heart of London. During these times, in May 1981, the head of the KGB, Yuri Andropov, warned senior officials in the Soviet Union that the United States was preparing to launch a nuclear strike against the Soviet Union. Although this wasn't true, the KGB was always overly paranoid. For example, when they discovered that American government buildings turned off their lights at night, they interpreted it as planning for war against them. A large number of cars near the Pentagon building meant an emergency meeting to discuss war details. What further increased their fears were the very harsh speeches of U.S. President Ronald Reagan. But in November 1983, the situation and tensions escalated abnormally after a routine military exercise conducted by NATO. This exercise was a simulation of nuclear war, but of course, for the KGB, this wasn't just an exercise, but a clear declaration of war against the Soviet Union. Therefore, they began to prepare their nuclear warheads, and the Soviet army was on full alert to enter a nuclear world war against the United States of America. And here, Gordievsky played his part. As soon as he learned of the Soviet Union's readiness to enter a nuclear war, he decided to inform MI6, telling them that the Soviet Union believed NATO was preparing for a nuclear attack. Margaret Thatcher, the British Prime Minister at the time, took Gordievsky's words very seriously and felt she had to de-escalate the situation quickly. Therefore, MI6 relayed Gordievsky's warnings to the CIA and President Reagan, who immediately decided to tone down his speeches and also began to communicate with Moscow and the current leader, Yuri Andropov. These communications paved the way for the INF Treaty, which stipulated a reduction in the number of nuclear weapons possessed by both countries. Thus, Oleg Gordievsky became the key and decisive player in de-escalating the situation and stopping a nuclear war that was on the brink of starting. The fall of Gordievsky. Gordievsky's identity was completely hidden within MI6, and only a very small number of people knew his true identity, whether within MI6 or the CIA. One of them was Aldrich Ames, the head of Soviet counterintelligence within the CIA. Although his mission was limited to protecting his country against Soviet spies, he decided to sell American information and secrets to the KGB for money. Because of this information, a large number of CIA and MI6 agents within the Soviet Union were discovered, and most of them were executed. Among these agents was Oleg Gordievsky, who was revealed to the KGB as working with MI6 for a very long time. In May 1985, after this information reached the KGB, they decided to summon Gordievsky to Moscow suddenly. On May 27th, he was summoned to a meeting with senior KGB officials. Before he reached the meeting place, he found that the KGB had diverted him from the scheduled location, and he was taken to an isolated compound belonging to the KGB. There, he met General Viktor Grushko, who initially reassured him that everything was fine, and even offered him food and drinks as if they were in a business meeting. But all of this was a trap. The drink he had contained SP-117, a powerful truth serum that affects brain cells and compels a person to talk, which the KGB used to force enemies to confess. After Gordievsky lost his balance, he was surprised by 2 KGB interrogators entering the room, and they began to question him about his involvement with MI6. But despite this pressure and their mention of the evidence they had against him, Gordievsky refused to talk and denied all charges against him. After 5 hours of interrogation, Gordievsky did not confess to anything that would incriminate him. Since the KGB had no real evidence, they eventually decided to let him go, but he was under very close surveillance. The Great Escape. Operation Pimlico. Although Gordievsky was free in Moscow, he was certain he was in danger, and that very soon the KGB would succeed in gathering concrete evidence against him, and he would be arrested again. And this time, there would be no interrogations. He would face execution. But, my friend, Gordievsky and MI6 had planned for this very well, and there was a very clever plan in place to smuggle Gordievsky out of the Soviet Union, prepared a long time ago, just waiting for the decisive moment for its execution. Before Gordievsky left Copenhagen the second time, he had asked MI6 to create an escape plan for him from Moscow in case his true identity was discovered. Indeed, British agent Valerie Pettit devised a plan called Operation Pimlico. The plan was that Gordievsky would go to a specific bakery in Moscow at 7:30 p.m. on a Tuesday, any week. Importantly, Gordievsky decided to send a signal to MI6 to inform them that this was the right time to execute the escape plan. On Tuesday, July 16, 1985, Gordievsky appeared on Kutuzovsky Prospect in Moscow and entered the designated bakery exactly at 7:30 p.m. Gordievsky waited for the MI6 agent to complete the second part of the plan. Indeed, after a short while, a person passed in front of the bakery eating a Mars bar, a sign that this person was the British agent Arthur Guy. As soon as Arthur Guy passed the store and exchanged glances with Gordievsky, it signaled the beginning of the operation, an operation personally approved by British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, who refused to abandon Gordievsky. 3 days after the signal, on July 19th, Gordievsky went out for his usual jog and managed to escape from under the eyes of the KGB agents who were watching him. He then reached the train station and boarded a train to Leningrad, then another train to Zelenogorsk. From there, he took a bus to kilometer marker 836, a remote area before the city of Vyborg, located on the border with Finland. Gordievsky was supposed to hide in the woods until MI6 agents arrived to transport him out of the Soviet Union. However, he arrived at the location a bit early and decided to continue to Vyborg to get a meal before traveling. But on the way, he realized it was getting late and asked a truck on the road to take him back to the first meeting point in the forest. Indeed, he returned to the forest and waited among the trees, hoping for the arrival of the MI6 agents. At that time, Roy Scott, head of the MI6 station in Moscow, his wife, and their child were on their way, with another car right behind them carrying Agent Arthur Geyer and his wife. But Soviet intelligence was behind them on the same road. However, as they approached the rendezvous point with Gordievsky, Scott and Arthur managed to slow down to shake off the KGB cars. Then, they headed to the forest to find Gordievsky waiting for them among the trees. Gordievsky was transported across the border with Finland in the trunk of the car. They successfully deceived the Soviet border guards, and Operation Pimlico succeeded. As soon as they crossed the Finnish border, they found Agent Valerie Pettit waiting for them. Gordievsky was then taken to Norway, and from Oslo he flew to London. Reactions. After the KGB discovered what had happened, they immediately detained his wife, Layla, and interrogated her about Gordievsky's escape. But she, in fact, knew nothing about the plan or his escape from Moscow at all. 2 years later, Layla managed to send him a letter reproaching her for leaving her and their children and escaping without telling her. During the crisis that occurred between the KGB and MI6 because of Gordievsky, British Prime Minister Thatcher contacted Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev and asked him to allow Layla and her children to leave the Soviet Union and reunite with Gordievsky. Even US President Reagan met Gordievsky and assured him that he would do everything he could to reunite him with his family. 6 years after his escape from Moscow, Layla and their children finally traveled to Britain after the collapse of the Soviet Union and reunited with Gordievsky. But despite this, their marriage did not last long. Gordievsky began writing books about the Soviet Union and the KGB. On the other hand, the Soviet Union sentenced him to death in absentia, and Russia, until very recently, was still pursuing him. And we say until very recently because on March 4th, 2025, Gordievsky died at the age of 86 from entirely natural causes. And here we reach the end of our story about one of the most famous double agents in human history. Thanks for watching.